The Curtiss Tomahawk was an export version of the P-40 Warhawk and saw service with various Allied forces during the Second World War. Although considered by many to be a little inferior to other fighter aircraft fielded by both sides at the time, it would prove to have some success in combat in many different theatres of that conflict. Hello everyone, Matt from Model Minutes here, and welcome back to the workbench. Today I'm building the Airfix Curtiss Tomahawk Mk.II in 1/48 scale, so join me as I find out what this kit is like. For a more in-depth look at the contents of the box, take a look at the dedicated unboxing video I made on that topic. For this video I will be focusing on the build of the kit and finishing it off with a review at the end. I'll put a list of products I used during this build on the screen now to give you an idea of the different paints and things you might want to get if you fancy a go at this one for yourself. And without any further ado, let's get into it. So, starting off, I began by removing the parts that I wanted with my cutters and then sanding any rough areas or flash with some files. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my cement of choice throughout this build, and the first thing to be assembled was the cockpit. The control column was glued into its holes on the floor of the cockpit. Then I added this part to the bulkhead frame. This was then also cemented into place on the cockpit floor. The pilot's chair was glued to its supports, then this was glued into place on the bulkhead frame. The bulkhead at the front of the cockpit was added into its slot, taking care to put it the right way round. A control lever was popped into its hole here, and whilst that cement was curing, I glued the blanking plate on the fuselage side. An alternative photo reconnaissance version can be built with this kit, and this is where the camera goes, but I'm not doing that version, so this blanking plate goes here instead. Now for some painting. This Hataka airbrush ready interior green acrylic paint was brushed onto the cockpit assembly and the interior areas of the fuselage. Next, some Vallejo black was painted onto various details on the cockpit wall parts, primarily focusing on the machine gun breeches and other control parts. Humbrol 62 leather acrylic was carefully applied to the headrest. There are some decals for the cockpit area, so I cut them from the main sheet and then soaked them in warm water. Humbrol decal fix was used to help apply them to the model and soften them into the surface details. A pilot is included in this kit, and it is my intention to display the model as if it is flying. So I test fit the pilot in the chair and then glued on his arms to try and make it look as though he was holding the controls. Easier said than done. Tamiya flat flesh was used to paint the pilot's face. Vallejo English uniform was brushed onto his trousers. US field drab was applied to his jacket. The Humbrol leather paint was used on his boots and flying helmet. This khaki colour was painted onto the gloves and strapping. When all the paint was dry, this sepia wash was brushed onto the figure to add some tone and shade to the recessed areas. You'll be able to notice that the goggles and face mask have been picked out in black. When the wash was dry, pale sand was dry brushed onto the figure to add some highlights to the raised areas and add further visual interest. With the pilot done, I moved back to the cockpit assembly with this aluminium paint being brushed onto the panels on the floor of the cockpit, and then some dry brushing on the cockpit parts to bring out those details and make it look a little worn. Now I can add the side walls to the cockpit assembly. The control panel was a little fiddly to get in place, but it is possible with some patience. I also glued the pilot into his chair. Before adding the cockpit into the fuselage, some clear parts need to be added. So this was done, and then the entire cockpit assembly was carefully positioned in one of the fuselage halves and glued into place. Moving on to the rest of the aircraft, I've already painted the radiator with the green and aluminium from before, and the air outflow part was glued onto it. This was then added to the bottom of the nose inside the plane. The front air intake and spacer for the nose could then also be glued into the fuselage. Now the other half of the fuselage can be attached, taking care to get everything to line up properly. The bottom of the nose took a little more force to get into place. Some spacers, which are moulded onto the top of the nose, need removing by cutting them away. This now means that the panels which mount the nose guns can be added. The guns can then be glued into their slots on these parts. There is a fairing on both sides of the wing roots which need to be added into place here on the fuselage parts. As mentioned, I'm going to display this model in a flying pose. I've got a 3D printed display stand and I need to open up the two holes in the bottom of the wing part to do this. I used a 2mm drill bit to carefully open them up. The other holes you can see here are for optional drop tanks, which I'm not using in this build, but it's nice to see that Airfix have considered different options for this kit. With these holes now open and cleaned up, I moved on to glue the landing gear wheel wells into place, and they almost snap into position with a little force. The lower wing assembly was then carefully put into position. The upper wing surfaces could then be glued into place, and then this small component which goes at the front of the landing gear base could also be glued on. The tail surfaces come in two parts which were glued together, and then these were added into their slots on the tail of the model. The elevator can be glued in a slightly raised or lowered position, and it's held in place by the rudder. The air exhaust comes with parts for open or closed positions. I opted to have mine closed. The tail wheel bay had its covers glued into position. You can display the landing gear lowered if you wish, however. I used Humbrol Clearfix to glue the bulletproof glass into place in front of the pilot. Then, having masked the canopy parts in my usual method, these were also glued into place on the cockpit. I did actually add a little tape inside the cockpit to prevent paint creeping in there later, so the canopy will have to be removed after painting to take that out. Moving on to the propeller. It was cemented onto the back plate, then the two-part spinner cemented on top. The axle was passed through the mounting part, and then this was glued into the back of the propeller assembly. If done correctly, the prop should rotate freely. The parts for the raised landing gear were assembled by pushing the hubs onto the tyres, then adding the legs into their holes. Now it's time to start painting. I gave the entire model, plus the small parts not attached, a base coat of this Humbrol No. 1 grey primer. A few thin coats should give a good uniform base layer for any subsequent paints to stick to. Sadly, I ran out of this paint before I could finish, so I had to use some of this generic spray primer to complete the job. Had this been a smaller scale model, I would have definitely had enough of the Humbrol primer. Maybe it's time to order some more. Hobbycraft white acrylic was now sprayed onto the propeller assembly. This should give a good base coat for the red that I will use later. This should help to make it a little more vibrant. To complete the paint scheme for this aircraft, I bought this Vallejo RAF Desert Colours set of airbrush ready paints, which has most of the colours I need for this model. It's thanks to my patrons and channel members on screen that I can afford to purchase new paints and products to try out in these builds, so a massive thanks to these guys. If you'd like to find out more on how to join them, take a look at the links in the description. First up, this azure blue was loaded into my airbrush, and a number of light coats were applied to the lower surfaces of the aircraft. I particularly like this colour, finding it sprays well straight out of the bottle with no further thinning required. Whilst that was drying, I used this red paint on the spinner on the propeller assembly. That white base layer allowing the paint to be really vibrant with only a few thin coats needed. Now back to the camouflage scheme. I used this middle stone colour on the upper surfaces of the model, having masked off the lower surfaces to prevent any overspray or bleed into the blue on the lower areas. I'll leave that to dry now before moving on. I was concerned that applying tape onto the paint too soon could peel it off, so I left it for about a day to fully cure. In the meantime, I painted the blades of the prop with the Vallejo black from before, and also the tyres on the landing gear. I did thin this paint with a little Tamiya X28 acrylic thinner to help it flow a little better. The azure blue used previously was painted onto the hubs of the wheels. I then carefully applied the aluminium paint to the landing gear legs. Vallejo gunmetal was painted onto the barrels of the machine guns and the engine exhausts. I mixed in a little gold paint with the gunmetal to give the engine exhausts a slightly more burnt look. Now I can move back to the painting of the camouflage scheme. I was really struggling with motivation, having tried to freehand the camo scheme and it didn't work out, so I've bought these pre-cut masks from AML which come ready to peel and stick onto the model. They do come in a number of parts, but they are relatively easy and quick to apply. When that was done, I used this dark earth paint to finish off the paint scheme on the model. When that was dry, I could remove all the masks and they seem to have done a really good job. I'd be tempted to get some more of these in the future as they make the job so much easier. Now it's time to protect the paint with this gloss varnish, which I thinned down with a little water in my airbrush. It was sprayed onto the entire model and should provide a smooth surface for the transfers to be applied to. And speaking of the transfers, these are printed by Cartograph and are of a really good quality. I'm going to use Microset and Sol as my decal solutions in this build. Having soaked the decals in warm water and applied some Microset from the blue bottle to the relevant place on the model, the decals were slid into place and carefully positioned. The application of the transfers was relatively straightforward, and after they were stuck to the model, some Microsol from the red bottle was brushed over the top to help them settle into the surface details. When the transfers were all cured, I used this K-Colors XW1 varnish to protect them, in preparation for the weathering in the next steps. It also dulls down the gloss varnish previously applied, as it seems to be a bit more matte in its finish. Next up, I thinned some Tamiya khaki paint and this was applied into the wheel wells on the lower side of the aircraft. Some Tamiya yellow was brushed onto the tips of the propeller. Revell Anthracite Grey enamel paint was thinned down with some white spirit to make a dark panel line wash. This was carefully brushed onto the various panel lines and details around the model to make them stand out a bit more. The excess was then carefully removed by a cotton bud with a small amount of white spirit on it. Working in the direction of the airflow, it should help give a fairly convincing realistic look. The shark's teeth decal on the nose hadn't quite gone on as well as I would have liked, so I fixed the gap with a little black paint. The chipped area on the bottom right was my fault, but I will hide that in a minute. I mixed this black paint and the K-Colors varnish from earlier in equal parts in my airbrush to create a thin paint for some weathering. I then carefully used this on the areas where exhaust staining might possibly be. I do need a little more practice with this technique, but after some repeated applications I was happy with the effect and moved on. I simulated some chipping of the paintwork using the aluminium paint from before, simply dabbing it into areas that may have seen damage or frequent handling. It would also help to hide any areas of chipped paint or decals, like that bit on the teeth mentioned earlier. I added the engine exhausts into their slots on the nose of the model. The wheels were glued into place on the bottom of the model, with the covers then also being cemented into the relevant positions. The barrels of the machine guns were pushed into their holes in the wings. So too was the pitot tube in the port wing. The propeller assembly was cemented into place on the nose of the model. The cockpit was carefully removed to take out that tape I'd put inside, just to make sure no paint accidentally found its way in there when it was being sprayed on. It was then re-glued and any areas of paintwork touched up. The masking tape was then carefully peeled away. Finally, the side windows could be glued into place with some Humbrol Clearfix. And that's it. That's as far as I went with my build of the Curtiss Tomahawk Mk.II in 1/48 scale from Airfix. So let's talk about this kit for a bit. I found on the whole that it was a very fun build. Certainly one of the more enjoyable kits that I've built recently. The fit of the parts was particularly good, with only a little sanding needed in a few places. I didn't end up using any filler on this kit either. I'm sure that perfectionists might want to use a little around the wing roots, as there is a tiny little gap there on my example, but perhaps that might be less noticeable with a little more manipulation with the construction at that point to close that gap up a little more. There wasn't anything in the way of flash on this kit either, and the moulded details were pretty good. I particularly like the texture on the wheel wells and the barrels of the machine guns. The transfers are excellent, and although I had a small issue with the fit of the shark's teeth on the nose and had to hide that with a little paint, the rest of them applied well, and I didn't notice any silvering of the film as a result. Having built a number of Airfix P40s in 1/72nd scale, it made a nice change to try out this larger version. The cockpit seemed pretty well detailed with the parts that came included in the kit, and the inclusion of a pilot was good too, even if his hands don't quite reach the controls. I'm sure it won't come as a surprise that this is not a particularly old tooling from the Airfix range, having been first introduced in 2016 in Pearl Harbor and Flying Tiger paint schemes. The version I have here though is the second release of the kit and featured this RAF desert scheme and also one for the Army Cooperation version, and dates from 2017. When I bought this kit a few years back, the RRP here in the UK was £22.99, but I managed to get it at a slight discount of £20, which in my opinion is a pretty good price for a model of this quality. At the time of this video, however, the Flying Tiger and Pearl Harbor version has been reintroduced to the range, but as with all things in recent times has seen a bit of a price increase to £28.99. Whilst not terribly expensive for this kit, I would always be inclined to shop around for the best price. Whilst this kit doesn't necessarily feature the surface details that other manufacturers manage to squeeze into their kits, I think that this allows for the potential for further improvements if the modeller so wishes, whilst still building into a rather presentable model. Looking back at my skills and techniques, I think that I do need a little more practice with airbrush weathering, as I normally use dry brushing and weathering powders, but it made a good change to try something new. And speaking of trying something new, using those pre-cut masks for the camouflage scheme made that element so much more enjoyable and less time consuming. A product I will certainly consider using on future projects if I find myself struggling with motivation. I really enjoyed using the Vallejo paints from the Desert Colors set, and when working on a new project I like these kind of things, as it just makes things a little bit easier as they all come ready to use. On the whole, I thoroughly enjoyed building this model, and I'm really happy with how it looks in the end, especially displayed on that 3D printed stand in the flying pose, something I'd like to do with more of my planes in the future, as it makes a nice change from having all my models stuck on the ground. I actually chose to do this kit as a result of a poll on my channel, where you guys in the community voted for the Desert Scheme version, which fit in quite nicely for it to be completed as part of a group build over on my Discord server. If you'd like to have the chance to vote on future projects featured on the channel, make sure you subscribe and turn those notifications on, which will mean you never miss a modelling video when it uploads as well. I think though it's time to wrap this video up here. This is a rather fun kit which benefits from a good standard of detail, mould quality, decals and instructions, which allow the creation of a fairly good representation of the Curtiss Tomahawk in 1/48 scale, and is certainly a kit that I would consider purchasing again in the future. After all, I do love a P40. Let me know what you think of my build in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, dropping a like would be massively appreciated. Finally, a big thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.